I was framed at work and fired. As a result, one manager got divorced, another ended up in jail. And keep listening to find out what happened next. This is a long story, but if you stick around till the end, you'll find out how I got screwed over and fired, how it set off a chain reaction that shook up the entire restaurant, got people transferred, arrested, deported, and even ended a marriage. So, let's begin. I worked at an upscale restaurant owned by a massive corporate chain with multiple brands. I had been there for about 3.5 years before I got kicked out, but we'll get to that part later. First, let me explain my role. From day one, I made it my goal to learn everything about the place. I was relentless when it came to understanding how different departments operated. I started as a waiter, but over time, I mastered nearly every role handling takeout orders, working as a host, bar backing, running banquet services, catering, and even deliveries. My main goal? Pick up as many shifts as possible. I was making around $12 an hour, though it fluctuated when I worked as a bartender or server since I could get tips. Eventually, management noticed that I was too damn efficient to keep in a regular role. They decided to test me as an unofficial supervisor for the takeout, catering, and delivery teams all under one umbrella. I knew this meant fewer shifts since I'd be locked into one department, so I negotiated a raise about $1.50 more per hour to make up for the lost hours. They agreed. Fair enough. I wasn't trying to get rich. I just needed to cover my bills, save a little for fun, and enjoy my life in Chicago. I had a pet, which added to my expenses, and at some point, I started dating someone, which meant more outings, more spending. Thanks to my pay and careful budgeting, I had things under control. Now, here's where things start getting interesting. The restaurant had a high turnover rate for managers. Every few months, a new one would come in, clueless about how things actually worked, screwing up our schedules and making decisions without understanding why certain systems were in place. Then came the news our current general manager was getting axed. His replacement? A guy with a reputation for fixing struggling restaurants. Let's call him Dean. A quick Google search of his name led us to something very interesting. The top result wasn't about his incredible managerial skills but a mugshot from a domestic violence arrest. Yeah, that kind of guy. When Dean took over, one of our best managers immediately quit. She refused to work with him and, like a goddamn oracle, warned us that we were in for a shitstorm of harassment, sexist remarks, and ultimately, the restaurant's downfall. And she was right. Dean wasted no time replacing the management team with his pew guys he'd worked with before. One by one, every manager got swapped out except for one, the kitchen manager. Let's call him Rick. Rick had been there since I started. The dude was a chameleon. His morals and work ethic shifted depending on who was in charge. Honestly, I respected his survival instincts, but deep down, I knew he was a spineless suck-up. Despite all the managerial reshuffling, Dean never bothered assigning anyone to oversee our department. So, we were left alone, with me as the unofficial leader. No one micromanaged us, and aside from a few hiccups, we ran things smoothly. But there was one problem since we had no manager. We constantly needed someone from upper management to handle tasks requiring a manager's card. More often than not, Rick was the one responding to our requests, simply because his kitchen was closest to us. Over time, the new management team just started treating Rick as our boss, and that, my friend, is where shit really started going downhill. Despite management treating Rick as our leader, the rest of the team still saw me as their supervisor. That meant every time Rick tried to push changes that would screw us over, everyone turned to me to smooth things over and keep things running as they always had. Our system worked, and I wasn't about to let him break it. Over the next few months, Rick and I butted heads constantly. Our biggest battle? Employee hours. He was convinced we should be making our money through tips like the servers. But the problem was that most of our orders came through Grubhub. And guess what? Grubhub doesn't tip. Our actual deliveries were rare. And even when they happened, the tips barely added up to $10 total. Split that between 4 people? Might as well be pocket change. Rick had no clue what he was talking about. Eventually, the tension led to a meeting with Dean, Rick, and our entire team. It was positioned as an open forum, where we could share concerns without fear of retaliation. So, we did. The team laid out every single issue: how Rick kept cutting our hours despite not being our official manager, how we were constantly overworked, and how the whole system was being set up to fail. When the topic of hiring an actual supervisor for our department came up, the team unanimously suggested me. I had already been running the department effectively for months, and even the corporate higher-ups frequently consulted me about scheduling, since I actually understood when people could and couldn't work due to school or family obligations. And that's when I saw it. Dean and Rick exchanged a look. That was it, the moment I knew. They weren't going to fix things, they weren't going to listen, they were going to get rid of me. Of course, they didn't say it outright. Instead, they made empty promises: no more slashing hours, no more leaving a single person to close the department alone. The job was too big for one person to handle solo and still meet safety and sanitation standards. We weren't asking for much. We agreed that 2 employees could be sent home early, but at least 2 needed to stay until closing. Dean nodded. He promised it would be that way. A week later, they were back to sending everyone home except for one poor soul left to clean and shut down the place alone. And one night, that poor soul was me. We had just come back from a huge catering event, and the cleanup was insane. Rick came in, saw the mess, and still tried to send everyone home, leaving me to deal with it all by myself. I called him out, reminding him that he was breaking the very agreement we made at that damn meeting. He just looked at me, smirked, and said I needed to stop complaining. Then, with zero hesitation, he added, "If you don't like it, I can find someone else to take your spot." I saw right through it. He was baiting me. He wanted me to push back harder. He wanted me to snap so he could turn it against me. So I backed off. I sucked it up and got to work. Of course, the amount of work was ridiculous, and I had to stay way past my scheduled hours to finish it. That meant overtime pay, higher wages. The next day, I was written up for unauthorized overtime. I refused to sign the write-up. I pointed out that I had told Rick the cleanup couldn't be done in time with just one person. The only reason they didn't force me to sign the document was that there happened to be an HR rep in the room, a rare occurrence, and they weren't one of Dean's lackeys. Now, let's fast forward to the day I got fired. Here's something important. I always showed up an hour early for my shift. Chicago is expensive as hell, and food isn't cheap. But at work, we were allowed unlimited soup and bread for free. So, I'd come in early, grab a meal, and be good to go. That day, I walked into the kitchen, planning to grab my usual soup, when one of the cooks waved me over. "Hey man, we've got this extra dish." Rick said to give it away. He told me it was already accounted for and written off. And, as luck would have it, it was one of my favorite appetizers. So, I took it, sat down in my usual booth, and started eating. That's when Dean and Rick appeared out of nowhere. "Did you order that dish?" Dean asked. I explained what happened. The cook had given it to me, saying Rick had already marked it off as a loss. Rick stared at me, face blank, and said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And then Dean said, "I think you already know this counts as theft. Finish your meal, pack your things, and get the hell out. This is your last meal here." I stared at Dean, then at Rick, trying to explain that the cook had given me the dish, that he said it was already written off. They weren't interested. I even suggested we go talk to the cook right then and there, but, conveniently, he had already left for the day. I had no choice. I packed up my things, said my goodbyes, and walked out. On my way to the door, I told my coworkers what had happened. They were pissed angry at the blatant setup, but more than anything, sad to see me go. Before leaving, I remembered that I had some tips waiting for me in accounting. I wasn't about to let them screw me out of my last bit of money. Right before I stepped into the office, something told me to be careful. I pulled up my phone, hit record, and slipped it into my pocket. The camera was blocked by fabric, so the screen was black, but the microphone was still working. And that's when I caught them, Dean and Rick, behind the door, talking in hushed voices. It went exactly as planned. Took longer than I expected, but at least he's gone now. They had been planning to get rid of me since that meeting with my team. I knocked on the door. Silence. Then, "What do you need?" "I'm just here for my tips." They handed me my money. I could barely contain my rage, but I didn't let it show. I smiled, shook their hands, and thanked them for the opportunity to work there. Then I walked out. but not before pulling out my phone and recording a clear shot of the restaurant's name and logo. Working in a restaurant teaches you one thing: always cover your ass. I had a feeling this recording was going to come in handy. If they were going to accuse me of stealing, I needed proof to clear my name. And sure enough, that recording was about to trigger a full-blown nuclear meltdown. On my way home, I started applying for new jobs. I fired off messages, made a few posts in local Facebook groups, and by the time my train pulled into my stop, I already had an interview lined up that same day. 5 minutes into that interview, they offered me a job. But the role wasn't a great fit, so I passed. I kept looking and eventually landed something perfect: a logistics auditing job. Higher pay. No customers. A dream. But during the interview, my new manager dropped a bombshell. I actually spoke with your former employer before this meeting. Oh no. Your general manager, Dean, was it? He told me you were fired for theft. Luckily, this guy wasn't an idiot. He gave me a chance to explain my side. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Does that voice sound like the same guy you spoke to? He listened. Yeah, that's him. That was all I needed. He heard Dean and Rick admitting they set me up, then watched the part where I recorded the restaurant's logo. You know what? You're hired. Not only that, but he asked me to send him the recording. I did. I thought that would be the end of it. 7 months later, I was well into my new job when our HR team sent out their usual welcome email for new hires. They included a fun fact about each person, plus their photos. And there, among the new faces, was Thomasone of my old co-workers from the restaurant. We used to work the host stand together. Excited to see a familiar face, I tracked him down to say hi. Didn't expect to see you here. What made you leave the restaurant? He gave me a look. Dude, I didn't leave. I was laid off. The company started investigating the place. Turns out, my recording had made its way to corporate. Someone had sent it directly to the higher-ups. That was all it took to trigger an internal audit. Thomas was surprised I didn't already know about it. Apparently, they had been trying to contact me for months. I checked my old email, the one I used when I first applied for that job, and sure enough, there were at least 20 emails from corporate, asking me to come in and discuss my termination. Since I had also changed my phone number, they had no way to reach me. Then Thomas told me what happened next. Before corporate even sent in their auditors, Dean and Rick panicked. They tried to buy off my former coworkers, offering them small raises in exchange for backing their story, claiming I was incompetent and that I just wasn't cut out for the job. But that was just the beginning, and things were about to spiral out of control in ways no one saw coming. The day the corporate auditor arrived, my former department experienced a mini exodus. Several employees quit on the spot right in front of the corporate representative, a woman we'll call Audrey. But before walking out, they didn't miss the chance to throw Dean and Rick under the bus. That was the first major hit against them. The second came just a few days later, when Audrey showed Dean and Rick the recording, the same one that had set everything in motion. They furiously denied everything. But Dean's voice? Impossible to mistake. It was too distinct. And if that wasn't enough, the recording captured the moment where they shook my hand and pretended we were parting on good terms. Dean and Rick even bragged to Audrey about it, thinking it made them look professional. But the real second hit came when corporate separated them. Audrey had Rick transferred to another restaurant under the parent company, while Dean was temporarily demoted. And that's when the cracks really started to show. They had always been a united, front-calculating, manipulative, and cold-blooded. But with the weight of the investigation pressing down on them, they turned on each other. Publicly. It started with a post on the restaurant's Facebook page. Someone from corporate uploaded a generic picture featuring employees, including Rick. Dean commented under the post, "Rick shouldn't even be in this photo. He was transferred for misconduct." Rick fired back, "Funny coming from a guy whose name pulls up a domestic violence arrest on Google." Dean wasn't about to let that slide. "At least I wasn't screwing my wife's sister, Rick." And then Rick dropped the nuke. "Yeah? And at least I wasn't sleeping with half the waitstaff. Every single one of them has a story about how you tried to get in their pants." The post was deleted quickly, but Audrey saw everything. That was the third hit. The fourth? Audrey started interviewing female employee servers, bartenders, anyone who might have dirt on Dean, and they all told the same story. Dean had a habit, a disgusting one. He would corner younger female employees, call himself their sponsor, and offer them financial favors in exchange for explicit photos or special time after closing shifts. That was it. Dean was fired, but that wasn't even the worst thing that happened to him. See, Audrey wasn't just some random auditor. She had history with this company. Years before, she had been the regional manager who personally hired Dean's wife as the general manager of another restaurant in the city. So what did Audrey do? She called Dean's wife, and she told her everything. A few months later, word got out. She filed for divorce. Apparently, she had already forgiven him once after he beat her. No one knows why she gave him a second chance after that, but there sure as hell wasn't going to be a third. But it wasn't over yet. After firing Dean, Audrey kept digging, and that's when she found out about Rick's little side business. She interviewed the cook, the same one who had given me that dish the day I was fired. Somewhere along the line, he accidentally let it slip that he was an undocumented immigrant. Audrey had his file in front of her. She had seen his social security number and Illinois state ID, so she pressed him for answers. And that's when everything unraveled. Rick had connections. He was running a black market document scheme, supplying fake social security cards and state IDs to undocumented workers so they could get hired at much lower wages. This had been going on for at least 4 years. And, well, forging government documents is highly illegal. Audrey had no choice but to report it. Local law enforcement stepped in but quickly realized they were out of their depth. Since some of the fraudulent documents had crossed state lines, the FBI was called in. Rick was arrested. And guess what? He snitched. Hard. He named 14 people who had bought fake papers from him. At least half of them were deported within months, including the cook, who had unknowingly triggered the investigation. By the time Thomas was let go, the entire restaurant was in chaos. And here's the wildest part. I never even sent that recording to corporate. I had only sent it to Dean, the manager who had hired me at my new job. So how the hell did it end up in the hands of the company's headquarters? Thomas had the answer. Turns out, Dean's wife was a lawyer. He had shared the recording with her, asking if I had grounds to sue my former employer. He knew what they did to me was blatantly illegal, but he also remembered something I had said during our first conversation. I'm not the kind of guy who sues people just to make a quick buck off two idiots' mistakes, but I had told him one thing. It sure as hell would feel good to see them both lose their jobs. And it was Dean's wife who sent the recording to the legal department of my old company's headquarters. And just like that, the entire house of cards came crashing down. My boss showed the recording to his wife, who then forwarded it to the higher-ups at my former company. They simply wanted to get two scumbags fired for what they had done to me. But instead, they pulled a thread on so long that it unraveled everything. It didn't stop until sexual harassment allegations were filed, until stories surfaced of managers cheating on their wives with employees they themselves had promoted, until divorces were finalized. Mass firings took place. An FBI investigation was launched into a black market document ring, and at least 6, possibly up to 14 people were deported. I don't know if you could call this nuclear revenge. I never set out to destroy them. But Thomas made one thing clear. Even if it wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, it was definitely a nuclear-level event. And the crater it left behind was massive. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe, leave a like, and have a great day.